They painted my grandfather's barn. While I slept, I walked outside before sunrise and found my grandfather's 60-year-old red barn painted beige-white overnight, stamped with Ridgeview HOA, exterior standard compliant. Brenda Lawson thought she'd finally forced me to obey. Then I checked my security camera, and what it captured at 1:17 a.m. made me question something much bigger than paint. Before I called the sheriff, I called a surveyor. What he found buried beside my fence threatened the HOA's boundary, a developer's 6-home expansion, and Brenda's entire story about why she crossed onto my ranch. If you enjoy stories where ordinary landowners stay calm, follow the evidence, and let the law do the talking, subscribe and stay with me, because that white barn was only the beginning. I knew something was wrong before I understood what I was looking at. It was just before sunrise on a Monday, and I had stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee in my hand when the barn caught the first gray light coming over the Wyoming hills. For more than 60 years, that barn had been deep red. My grandfather, Henry Morgan, built it with his own hands when the ranch was still mostly open range and gravel road. He had replaced boards, patched the roof, reinforced the doors, but he never changed that color. Neither did my father. Neither did I. That morning, the entire southern wall was beige-white. Across the fresh paint, in block letters big enough to read from the county road, someone had stenciled, Ridgeview HOA, exterior standard compliant. I stopped halfway down the porch steps. For a few seconds, I did not feel angry. I felt empty. The barn was one of the last things on Morgan Ranch that still looked almost exactly the way it did when Henry was alive. I lived alone now, and I had spent years protecting details most people would have considered unimportant. The original hinges, the hand-cut braces, the red finish that showed through every old family photograph. Somebody had crossed my fence in the middle of the night and painted over all of it. Not because the barn was unsafe, not because it threatened anyone, because Brenda Lawson had decided she did not like the color. I set my coffee on the porch rail and walked across the yard. The paint was still tacky in places. Tire marks cut through the damp dirt near the east side of the barn. A few drops of beige paint dotted the grass. Near the chain that marked the service opening beside my workshop, one link had been left twisted at an angle. That was when the anger finally arrived. But I had spent too many years working county road projects to let anger make decisions for me. I did not call Brenda. I did not drive into Ridgeview. I did not touch the paint. I went straight into my workshop and pulled up the security system. The camera above the door covered most of the yard, including the barn and the east access opening. I rolled the footage backward. Nothing. 142, nothing. 20. Then headlights appeared beyond the fence. I slowed the recording. At 1:17 a.m., a dark SUV stopped beside my east boundary. The driver's door opened. Brenda Lawson stepped out. Even in grainy night footage, I recognized the way she moved. Fast, certain, like she had already decided everyone around her would eventually agree. Todd Mercer climbed out from the passenger side. A contractor's pickup followed behind them. Todd walked to my chain, lifted it off the post, and dragged it aside. No hesitation, no knock at the house, no attempt to call me. They simply entered. The contractor unloaded a compressor sprayer. Brenda pointed towards the barn. Todd stood watch near the opening, while the first strip of red disappeared beneath beige paint. I watched 20 minutes of footage without moving. Then Brenda did something that made my jaw tighten. She walked up to the finished wall, shined a flashlight across it, and inspected the words they had stenciled there. She stepped back. Todd said something I could not hear clearly. Brenda laughed. That laugh changed the situation for me. This was not a misunderstanding. It was not an overzealous maintenance crew. She had been there. She had directed it, and she had enjoyed the result. I copied the footage onto 2 separate drives, then I photographed the tire tracks, the displaced chain, the paint drops, and every section of wall they had touched. Only after that Did I call Laura Bennett? Laura had already answered enough Ridgeview letters for me to know what she was going to say. Morgan Ranch is not in the HOA, she told me after I described the video. They have no architectural authority over your barn. Don't alter anything yet. Preserve the footage. I already did. There was a pause. Caleb, are you calling the sheriff? Eventually. That answer surprised her. What are you doing first? I looked through the workshop window toward the east side of the property. For months, Brenda's letters had become more aggressive every time I reminded her where Ridgeview's authority ended. Fence color, tall grass, my cattle trailer, my mailbox, then the barn. But there was something else I had noticed. Each complaint seemed to focus more closely on the same side of my ranch, the east side, the strip beside Ridgeview's rear gate, the old gravel lane, the drainage ground my father used to clear every spring. I had dismissed it as obsession. Standing there with fresh paint drying on Henry Morgan's barn, I stopped dismissing anything. I ended the call with Laura and dialed Raymond Cole. Raymond was 68, retired from county surveying, and had forgotten more about old Wyoming plats than most people ever learned. He answered on the fourth ring. Cole, Raymond, it's Caleb Morgan. Morning, Caleb. Something wrong? I looked at the beige wall through the window. Somebody painted my barn last night. There was silence. Who? Ridgeview, HOA. Another pause. Then Raymond said, You calling because you want a witness? No. I pulled open the drawer where I kept my grandfather's old property papers. Before I call the sheriff, I need you to tell me exactly where my east boundary is. Raymond's voice changed. Not much. Just enough. Why are you asking me that? I looked past the barn toward Ridgeview's rear fence and the narrow strip of ground separating their subdivision from land my family had held for generations. Because Brenda Lawson just crossed onto my ranch at 1:17 in the morning, I said. And I'm starting to wonder if the paint is the least important thing she crossed. Raymond was quiet for several seconds. Then he said, Don't move any stakes. Don't let anyone move anything. I won't. I'll pull the old plats. I looked back at my grandfather's barn, white against the morning sky. Pull all of them. When the call ended, I stood there listening to the compressor silence of the empty yard and watching sunlight spread across paint that had no right to be there. For years, everyone had treated the boundary between Morgan Ranch and Ridgeview as settled. That morning, for the first time, I wondered whether the people who kept telling me where their authority began had ever bothered to check where their land actually did. Brenda Lawson had been testing that line long before she painted my barn. The first notice came over my split-rail fence. Ridgeview called its weathered wood inconsistent with community appearance standards. I mailed back a copy of my deed. The second notice complained about my cattle trailer being visible from the subdivision road. I sent the deed again. Then came tall grass along the drainage strip, my old mailbox, and finally, the deep red barn itself. Every letter looked official: Ridgeview letterhead, violation numbers, compliance deadlines, Brenda's signature at the bottom. But official-looking paper and legal authority were two different things. Laura had confirmed that more than once. Morgan Ranch predated Ridgeview by decades. My family had never joined the association, signed its covenants, or subjected the ranch to its architectural restrictions. The last time Brenda threatened fines over the barn, Laura sent her a letter that could not have been clearer. Morgan Ranch was outside Ridgeview HOA jurisdiction. No HOA architectural standard applied to my buildings. Any attempt to enter, alter, or exercise control over my property without permission would be challenged. Brenda received it. I had the certified mail receipt. That mattered a lot more now. By noon, Laura was sitting at my kitchen table with a copy of the latest violation notice beside her. I had left the barn exactly as we'd found it. She read the notice twice. This language is new. She tapped one paragraph, The HOA claimed my barn fell within a community visual buffer standard covering properties visible from Ridgeview's common areas. You ever seen that phrase before? I asked. No. She opened Ridgeview's recorded covenants on her laptop and searched them. Nothing. She checked the architectural rules. Nothing. Then she pulled recent board minutes available to homeowners. There it was, Community Visual Buffer. The phrase first appeared only weeks earlier in a meeting summary describing a proposed policy for protecting neighborhood appearance and future development compatibility. Laura leaned back. They didn't discover authority over your ranch, Caleb. Somebody invented a phrase and then treated it like law. That's what it looks like. My phone buzzed before I could answer. Amy Parker. She lived inside Ridgeview near the rear entrance and had always kept herself out of Brenda's disputes. Her message was short. Can we talk somewhere Brenda won't see us? 20 minutes later, Amy pulled her pickup beside my equipment shed. She looked at the white barn before she looked at me. I didn't know they were going to do that. I believe you. She lowered her voice anyway. A few days ago I saw Brenda by the rear gate with Gregory Walsh. I knew the name. Gregory was the developer pushing Ridgeview Phase 2. What were they doing? Looking at maps. That got Laura's attention. Amy said she had been walking home when she saw Gregory spread several large sheets across the hood of his truck. Brenda stood beside him. They weren't looking toward the houses, Amy said. They kept pointing this way. At what? Your barn first, then that gravel lane. She pointed toward the old service track running along my eastern pasture, and the drainage strip. The kitchen went quiet. Did you hear anything? Laura asked. Not enough that I'd swear to exact words, but Gregory kept tracing something on the map from the rear gate toward Caleb's side. Why didn't you tell me? Amy looked uncomfortable. Because until somebody painted your barn at 1 a.m, 2 people looking at a map didn't seem like much. That was fair. Now it seemed like plenty. After Amy left, Laura and I drove slowly along my eastern fence. Ridgeview's decorative fencing followed the subdivision side. Their rear gate sat near the old gravel lane. A narrow drainage channel ran between sections of both properties before disappearing beneath a culvert. I had looked at that ground thousands of times. Now I looked at it differently. The complaints Brenda had sent me were supposedly about appearance, but fence color, tall grass, the barn, even the cattle trailer all had one thing in common. They were concentrated along this side of Morgan Ranch. Laura noticed it too. If Gregory needs something here, she said, we don't assume what it is, we prove it. Exactly. Raymond called that afternoon. He had found the old county material. Caleb, I've got your grandfather's plat and the original monument references. Anything strange? Maybe. That single word tightened something in my chest. What kind of maybe? The Ridgeview improvement drawing I'm looking at doesn't line up cleanly with one of the old reference points. How far off? I don't know yet. I stared through the windshield toward their rear gate, Raymond continued. And I'm not giving you an answer from a desk. I want boots on the ground. When? Tomorrow morning. Before we hung up, Laura asked him to bring copies of everything he found. That evening, another Ridgeview envelope appeared in my mailbox. I expected an apology. Instead, it was another warning. The HOA claimed the newly painted barn now satisfied the community visual buffer and instructed me not to make unauthorized exterior alterations that would restore its previous appearance. I read that sentence twice. They had entered my ranch illegally, painted my grandfather's barn without permission, and now they were warning me not to undo what they had done. I handed the letter to Laura. She stared at Brenda's signature. Then she said, "Keep this." I slid it into the evidence folder. By then, I understood something I hadn't understood that morning. The white paint was real. The arrogance behind it was real. But neither explained why Brenda had been standing beside a developer days earlier, studying the exact strip of ranch she suddenly claimed the right to control. If she had no authority over my barn, there was only one question left. What did Gregory Walsh need from the land beside it badly enough for Brenda to pretend she did? Raymond Cole arrived just after 7 the next morning, with old plats rolled under one arm and enough survey equipment in his truck to make it clear he had no intention of guessing. He spread the first map across my workbench. "This is the Morgan filing," he said. "Older than Ridgeview by decades." Then he placed a newer subdivision improvement plan beside it. At first, the lines looked almost identical. Almost. Raymond tapped to one corner of the older plat. "This monument reference is bothering me." I leaned closer. The original drawing showed an iron marker near the east boundary, not far from an old cottonwood and the drainage ditch my father had cleaned every spring. "What happened to it?" "Probably nothing," Raymond said. "People forget where monuments are. Dirt doesn't. That was why we went looking." We walked the boundary with Laura following several yards behind, photographing every marker and every point Raymond checked. I knew the land by memory: weathered fence posts, cattle tracks, the shallow drainage cut, the old gravel lane running toward Ridgeview's rear gate. Raymond trusted none of that. He trusted coordinates. He stopped near the cottonwood, checked his instrument, moved 10 feet south, checked again, then crouched and pushed aside dead grass. "Bring me the detector." 20 minutes later, it gave a sharp tone. Raymond dug carefully with a hand tool until rust appeared beneath the dirt. An iron monument. Still there. He brushed the soil from its top and checked the old plat again. Then he measured, once, twice, a third time from another point. I had worked around survey crews long enough to know silence could be more important than conversation. Finally, I asked, "How bad?" Raymond stood. "Your grandfather's line is where the original filing says it is. That sounds good. For you." He turned toward Ridgeview. The decorative fence on their side ran parallel to ours. Beyond it stood a camera pole, the rear gate, and part of a drainage structure poured years after Morgan Ranch had been established. Raymond pointed. "The newer subdivision plan appears to have been laid out from the wrong secondary reference." Laura stepped closer. "How far?" Raymond looked down at his notes. "Nearly 8 feet through this section. 8 feet. I almost laughed. After everything Brenda had done, 8 feet sounded small. Then Raymond started walking. He stopped at Ridgeview's decorative fence. "This section crosses the recorded Morgan boundary." A few steps later, he pointed at their camera pole. "That too. Then the rear gate. The post on this side is inside your line." He moved toward the concrete drainage structure. "So is part of that." Finally, he stood at the edge of the gravel lane. "And this is where it becomes expensive." The lane clipped the Morgan side along the narrowest part of the corridor. Not by much, but enough. Laura photographed the position of Raymond's temporary stakes against the gate and lane. I looked back toward the barn. The white paint seemed different now. Not less insulting. More calculated. "Could Ridgeview have known?" I asked. Raymond shook his head. "The survey tells us where the line is. It doesn't tell us who knew what." Laura nodded. "And that's the distinction we keep. We did not need to exaggerate. The facts were getting stronger on their own." Raymond spent the rest of the morning verifying the line from multiple recorded points. By noon, the pattern held. The error was not a crooked fence post. It was systemic along the critical stretch. Ridgeview had treated a strip of Morgan land as if it were common property for years. I could have felt triumphant. Instead, I felt something closer to anger. My family had respected that boundary for generations. Brenda had spent months accusing me of violating rules on land she did not control, while HOA structures were sitting inside mine. Laura must have read my expression. "Don't touch anything yet." "I know. Raymond needs to finish the survey. Then we document. Then we give notice." I nodded. Truth first. Reaction second. That had always been the better order. Before leaving, Raymond drove one temporary stake beside the old iron monument and another near the gravel lane. Brenda noticed them before sunset. Her SUV stopped on the Ridgeview side of the rear gate. She got out, stared at the stakes, then looked directly toward my house. She did not cross the line this time. She pulled out her phone instead. A few minutes later, Gregory Walsh's pickup rolled in behind her. They stood beside the gate talking. Gregory pointed at Raymond's new stake. Then he pointed down the gravel lane, not toward the existing homes, toward the undeveloped ground beyond them. I watched from my porch without moving. Laura had told me not to assume motive before we had documents. She was right, but one thing was already clear. 8 feet of Wyoming dirt had suddenly made 2 very confident people nervous. And by then, the question was no longer whether Ridgeview had crossed my boundary. It was why that particular strip mattered enough for a developer to show up the same day we proved where it really was. Laura found the answer 2 days later. She called me from her office and told me not to discuss the survey with Brenda, Todd, or Gregory until she arrived at the ranch. When she walked into my kitchen that afternoon, she carried a county planning file thick enough to answer more questions than I had asked. Gregory filed preliminary documents for Phase 2 6 months ago, she said. I knew Ridgeview wanted to expand someday. I had heard homeowners mention it at the feed store, but nobody had ever suggested the project had anything to do with Morgan Ranch. Laura unfolded a site plan across my table. 6 new homes were drawn beyond Ridgeview's existing rear section. A construction route was marked in heavy dashed lines. It ran from the current subdivision, through the rear gate, down the gravel service lane, and across the exact strip Raymond had just proven belonged partly to me. I followed the line with one finger. He needs this for trucks. According to the engineering notes, yes. Laura showed me another page. The existing neighborhood streets had tight turns, landscaping islands, and pavement not designed for repeated heavy construction traffic. Improving them would cost Gregory money and force revisions to his current plan. The rear lane was shorter, straighter, cheaper, and the narrowest part of it depended on land Gregory did not own. Then Laura slid one final drawing toward me. A note beside the route read, "Future construction access. Subject to boundary resolution." I read it twice. They knew. Gregory knew there was a boundary issue, Laura corrected. That is what this proves. What about Brenda? Not yet. I looked toward the window. From my kitchen, I could see part of the beige-white barn wall. She was standing beside him looking at these maps before they painted my barn. Amy saw them looking at maps. She did not see this exact sheet. Laura's voice stayed measured. That was one reason I trusted her. She never made evidence say more than it actually said. If we're going to claim Brenda was trying to establish fake HOA control over your property, she continued, we need proof of intent. Right now we have motive, timing, and a pattern. That sounds like a lot, it is, but it isn't the same thing as proof. I sat back. The whole dispute looked different now. The fence complaints, the tall grass notices, the so-called visual buffer, the letters about my barn. Each one created another piece of paper claiming Ridgeview had some right to regulate the eastern edge of Morgan Ranch. If those claims went unanswered long enough, somebody might later point to the history and say the HOA had always treated that strip as part of its controlled area. I had answered every notice. That suddenly mattered more than I had realized. Laura seemed to follow the same thought. Keep every response you sent them. I have them all. Good. Those letters show you never accepted their authority. That evening, Raymond delivered his signed preliminary survey package. The corrected line confirmed the 8-foot discrepancy through the critical section and identified each Ridgeview improvement crossing onto Morgan property, rear gate, camera pole, fence, drainage structure, gravel lane edge. Laura added the survey to the planning file. For the first time, the 2 sets of documents told one story. Ridgeview had built beyond its line. Gregory wanted access through that same area. Brenda had spent months trying to regulate my side of it, but we still lacked the document connecting Brenda directly to Gregory's access problem. The next morning, Ridgeview gave us one more piece. A certified envelope arrived before breakfast. I opened it at the kitchen table. The board acknowledged that the barn had recently been brought into compliance with Ridgeview's community visual buffer standard. Then came the sentence that made me stop. Pending HOA review, I was instructed not to repaint, modify, or otherwise alter the barn's newly compliant exterior. They had entered my ranch without permission, painted my property in the middle of the night, and now they were creating a written record claiming I needed their permission to undo it. I called Laura. She read the letter while I waited. "Don't respond yet," she said. "You think they're trying to make the paint look official? I think they're documenting a claim of authority they don't have. That sounds deliberate. It sounds useful." That was the first time I smiled since seeing the barn, not because anything had been fixed, because Brenda had finally stopped making her claims verbally and started putting them in writing. That afternoon, I saw Gregory's truck at Ridgeview's rear gate again. Brenda stood beside him. This time Todd was there too. The three of them looked toward Raymond's stakes, then toward my gravel lane. None crossed onto the ranch. They had learned that much. I stood behind my fence holding the certified letter they had just sent me and understood the stakes clearly now. Gregory needed the cheapest route to build 6 more houses. Ridgeview needed my land to make that route work. And Brenda was trying to create a paper trail suggesting the HOA already had authority where it legally had none. I knew what they wanted. What I did not yet know was how far Brenda had gone to help Gregory get it. And until I could prove that, the strongest weapon I had was patience. So I stopped arguing with her. No calls, no angry emails, no visit to the HOA office. I let the beige-white barn stand exactly as they had left it, ugly enough to bother me every time I crossed the yard, and useful enough to remind me not to move too fast. For the next several days, my kitchen table became a case file. Deeds, recorded covenants, Raymond's signed survey, certified photographs of the barn, copies of every Ridgeview notice Brenda had sent. My written responses denying HOA jurisdiction, 2 backups of the security footage, county planning documents for Gregory's Phase 2. Laura added contractor records and correspondence logs, then numbered each item so we could trace exactly when Ridgeview had been warned and what they did afterward. "You're building this like a road claim," she said. "That kept people honest for 30 years. Keep doing it." We did. Raymond finalized the survey and marked the encroachments one by one. The rear fence crossed the Morgan line. The security camera pole stood inside it. One rear gate post did too. Part of the drainage structure clipped my property, and the gravel lane touched the boundary exactly where Gregory's Phase 2 plan needed heavy trucks to pass. Laura then sent Ridgeview formal notice. The letter did not threaten, it did not accuse. It simply stated that a certified survey had established the Morgan boundary and identified specific HOA improvements located on my land. Ridgeview was given a reasonable period to inspect the documentation and remove or relocate those structures voluntarily. Laura also made one thing clear. No construction, maintenance, or expansion traffic was authorized across Morgan Ranch. That sentence changed the stakes. 2 days later, Amy called me. "Brenda's telling people you're backing down." I almost laughed. "What exactly did she say? That you haven't challenged the barn notice, so she thinks you're accepting the visual buffer rule." I looked at the evidence folders stacked beside my coffee. "Let her think that." Amy hesitated. "She's also telling residents the stakes Raymond put in are temporary and don't affect HOA property. That part won't age well." By then, I understood Brenda's weakness. She needed visible resistance. She needed me angry enough to make a mistake she could describe as harassment, retaliation, or instability. Silence gave her nothing to work with, so she filled it herself. Todd began appearing near the rear gate more often. He posted a small HOA notice on the Ridgeview side warning residents not to interfere with community infrastructure pending legal review. Laura photographed it before sunset. The next morning, I found another letter in my mailbox. Todd had signed this one. It said the HOA rejected our demand to remove the encroachments and considered Raymond's survey disputed. Then came the line Laura immediately circled. "OA infrastructure cannot be disturbed without board authorization." She slid the paper back toward me. "They're making this easier. They're refusing to move. They're documenting that refusal. The deadline in Laura's notice passed on Friday. Nothing moved, not the fence, not the camera, not the gate, not one bolt. Instead, Todd parked his pickup near the rear entrance for almost an hour that afternoon, as if his presence could turn the survey stakes back into ordinary dirt. I drove out there before dusk and checked every marker. They were untouched. Good. I took new photographs from multiple angles. Then I called Sheriff David Turner. I had known David for years, but I kept the conversation formal. I told him we had a certified boundary survey, written notice, documented HOA encroachments, and an expired voluntary removal deadline. I also told him Laura was preparing the next legal step. He listened carefully. You expecting trouble? I'm expecting Brenda. That wasn't my question. I looked toward the white barn. No, I'm not looking for trouble. I'm trying to avoid anyone claiming later they didn't know what I was doing. David was quiet for a moment. Send me the documents before you touch anything. I will. That mattered. If the next move happened, there would be no surprise ambush and no room for Brenda to claim I had suddenly attacked community property. Everything would be documented first. Laura reviewed the file one final time that evening. We're within the survey, she said. We have notice. We have refusal. If you remove anything, you do it carefully and preserve it. No destruction. Exactly. I nodded. That was how I wanted it. I did not want revenge. I wanted the line respected. But Brenda had made one thing clear. She was not going to move anything voluntarily because she still believed confidence could substitute for ownership. Saturday morning, I called 2 ranch hands I trusted. Then I called a contractor in the next county and reserved a small excavator. By noon, the machine was scheduled for delivery at first light Monday. Brenda still thought my silence meant I was doing nothing. She had no idea that by the time the sun came up, every letter she had ignored was going to become a physical line in the dirt. And if she refused to move HOA property off Morgan land, I was about to show her what happened when I did it legally. The excavator arrived at 6:40 Monday morning. Before its engine started, I photographed the boundary again. Raymond's stakes were still exactly where he had placed them. Laura had copies of every notice. Sheriff David Turner had received the survey, photographs, and correspondence the night before. Nothing about that morning was improvised. The 2 ranch hands working with me had one instruction. We don't break anything we can remove. The camera pole came first. We disconnected nothing ourselves that required electrical work. A licensed technician I had arranged lifted the HOA equipment clear, labeled it, and placed it safely on Ridgeview's side. Then we moved to the decorative fence. Bolts came out, panels were lifted. Every section was stacked neatly beyond the corrected boundary. By 7:30, the survey stakes were visible from the Ridgeview Road. That was when Brenda arrived. Her SUV stopped hard beside the rear gate. Todd's pickup pulled in less than a minute later. Brenda got out before the dust settled. What the hell do you think you're doing? I shut down the excavator. The sudden silence carried her voice farther than the engine had. Removing encroachments from Morgan Ranch. That fence belongs to Ridgeview. I know. You have no right to touch HOA property. I climbed down with Raymond's certified survey under my arm. I gave Ridgeview notice. I rejected your notice. You don't get to reject a property line. Todd walked toward us, phone already recording. This is vandalism, Caleb. Keep recording. That slowed him down. I handed Brenda the survey. She barely looked at the first page. These stakes mean nothing. Ridgeview has maintained this area for years. Maintenance isn't ownership. We know where our property starts. I looked at the white barn behind me. That's what got my barn painted. For once, Brenda had no immediate answer. Then she pointed toward the stacked fence panels. You put every piece back where it was. No, I am ordering you as president of Ridgeview. You're standing outside Ridgeview. Her face tightened. That was when Sheriff Turner arrived. Brenda moved toward his cruiser almost immediately. Sheriff, thank God. He's destroying HOA property. David stepped out, looked at the equipment, then at me. Anything damaged? Nothing. He examined the stacked panels. I handed him the same document packet I had sent the night before. Brenda stared at him. You're letting him do this? David kept his voice level. I'm here to keep this from becoming something it isn't. Boundary ownership is a civil matter, unless somebody gives me a reason to make it something else. He's stealing our fence. I pointed to the stack. It's right there. David looked at Brenda. Ma'am, nobody's stealing anything. Todd lowered his phone slightly. Brenda didn't. She called Ridgeview's attorney. While we waited, I stopped all work. That was Laura's advice. Once Ridgeview's counsel was coming, there was no advantage in giving Brenda another argument. Raymond arrived 15 minutes later and began checking his stakes again. Laura pulled up shortly after him. By then, several Ridgeview homeowners were watching from the road. Amy stood near her pickup without saying anything. Brenda paced beside the rear gate, making phone calls. Then Gregory Walsh arrived. That changed the mood. He did not ask about the fence. He walked directly toward the gravel lane. His eyes followed Raymond's stakes from the gate toward the undeveloped ground beyond Ridgeview. What's the status of this line? He asked. Raymond answered before Brenda could, surveyed and certified. Gregory's jaw tightened. How much of the lane? Enough that I'd read the report before planning truck access. Brenda shot Raymond a look. This has nothing to do with Phase 2. Nobody had mentioned Phase 2. Laura looked at me. I said nothing. Neither did Gregory. That silence told me more than Brenda intended. 20 minutes later, Ridgeview's attorney arrived carrying a leather case and the confidence of a man who had apparently been told he was coming to stop an irrational rancher with an excavator. Brenda met him halfway. Finally. Tell him he can't remove our property. The attorney looked at the stacked fence sections, the survey stakes, Sheriff Turner's cruiser, and Laura standing beside Raymond. Then he looked at me. Mr. Morgan? Yes. I'd like to see whatever you're relying on before anything else happens. That's why we stopped. Laura opened the folder across the hood of my pickup. First came the original Morgan plat, then the monument references, then Raymond's certified survey, then the photographs, then Ridgeview's development drawings. Finally, Gregory's Phase 2 access plan. The attorney stopped talking. He moved one sheet over another and compared the lines. Raymond pointed toward the buried iron monument. The attorney walked out to see it himself. When he came back, his expression had changed. Brenda noticed. What? He didn't answer. He studied the Phase 2 drawing again. Gregory stepped closer. The attorney looked from the dashed construction route on the page to the survey stakes cutting beside the gravel lane. For the first time that morning, Brenda stopped issuing orders. The excavator sat silent behind me. Nobody touched the fence. Nobody touched the gate. And while Ridgeview's own attorney read the documents, Brenda had spent weeks pretending did not matter. I watched Gregory Walsh realize that 8 feet of Morgan dirt might be standing between him and 6 new houses. Then the attorney closed the folder. Everybody stays exactly where they are, he said. Brenda smiled. She thought he was talking to me. She was about to learn otherwise. Brenda folded her arms and looked straight at the excavator. You heard him, Caleb. Shut this down. Ridgeview's attorney did not move. I wasn't talking to him. The smile left her face. Nobody said anything for a second. Then he turned toward Gregory Walsh. You need to stop treating this route as available. Gregory's expression hardened. What exactly are you saying? The attorney reopened Raymond's certified survey on the hood of my pickup. I'm saying the Morgan boundary is supported by the original monument references, the recorded plat, and the resurvey. Unless someone produces stronger contrary evidence, this is the line I would expect a court to recognize. Brenda stepped closer. That can't be right. Ridgeview has maintained this strip for years. Maintenance is not title. I had already said the same thing. It sounded different coming from her own lawyer. Todd tried next. About the gate, the camera, the drainage work. We paid for all of that. The attorney looked at him. That may explain ownership of the improvements. It does not establish ownership of the ground underneath them. Raymond pointed toward the iron monument and then to the row of fresh stakes. The physical evidence matches the recorded coordinates. Gregory picked up the Phase 2 drawing. What does this do to construction access? No one answered immediately. That was the question that mattered. Laura finally did. It means you do not have an automatic right to move construction traffic across Morgan land. Gregory looked at me. We're talking about a few feet. We're talking about my property. There are ways to solve that. Sure, I said. You can ask, Brenda cut in. This is exactly why Ridgeview needed consistent control along that edge. Laura turned toward her. Consistent control over property Ridgeview does not own? Brenda realized too late what she had said. She changed direction immediately. I mean visual control. Community standards. Those standards don't apply to Morgan Ranch. They do within the buffer. Laura pulled the recorded covenants from the file. Show me where. Brenda did not take them. The road had gone quiet enough that I could hear one of my cattle bawling from the pasture behind the barn. Sheriff Turner remained near his cruiser, watching without inserting himself into the civil argument. That restraint mattered. Nobody could later claim I had used law enforcement to intimidate the HOA. The documents were doing that work. Ridgeview's attorney asked Brenda for the authority creating the visual buffer. She told him it had been adopted by the board. Recorded amendment? She hesitated. Board policy? Signed by Morgan? No. Recorded against Morgan Ranch? No. Then it doesn't give Ridgeview jurisdiction over his barn. Todd looked toward Brenda. That was the first visible crack between them. Gregory was still focused on the access map. If the line stands, can Ridgeview grant me an easement? Not across land Ridgeview doesn't own, the attorney said. Gregory lowered the paper slowly. I could see the calculation happening. A reroute meant engineering changes, grading, revised approvals, and money. He had not come there because he cared about a camera pole. He had come because Phase 2 depended on a shortcut that suddenly belonged to someone else. Brenda tried one final time. Caleb has been using this dispute to harass the association. Laura almost smiled. He gave written notice before removing anything. Your board refused. He preserved every improvement. The sheriff was informed in advance. Which part are you calling harassment? Brenda had no answer. The attorney closed the folder. My advice is simple. Ridgeview stops asserting control over the disputed strip until this is formally resolved. No one moves the Morgan stakes. No one uses the rear lane for construction traffic. And no one enters Morgan Ranch without permission. That last sentence landed harder than the rest. Brenda stared at me. For weeks, she had acted as though her title gave her authority over anything she could see from Ridgeview. Now her own lawyer had reduced that authority to its actual boundary. Gregory walked several yards away and made a phone call. Todd stopped recording. Amy, still near her pickup, watched Brenda without saying a word. I thought the confrontation was over. Then Brenda pointed toward my barn. At least the painting was an honest mistake. I looked at her. What mistake? The contractor believed you'd agreed to the exterior correction. Todd immediately nodded. There was confusion about authorization. That was new. 3 days earlier, Ridgeview had sent me a certified letter claiming the barn was officially compliant and warning me not to repaint it. Now that the boundary had collapsed beneath them, the midnight operation had become a misunderstanding. Laura heard it too. Are you saying Ridgeview did not authorize the painting? Brenda hesitated. I'm saying the contractor may have misunderstood the scope. I looked at Todd. And the chain? What chain? The one you moved at 1:17 in the morning. His face changed. Not much, enough. Brenda looked at him, then back at me. You can make all the accusations you want. I don't need to. That was the moment I realized they still did not understand what I had preserved. They knew about the survey. They knew about the certified letters. They knew Raymond had found the old monument. But Brenda had never once asked how I knew the exact time they crossed onto my land. Laura closed her folder and looked at me. I gave her a small nod. We did not play the footage there. We did not argue in front of the neighbors. We let Brenda keep talking, because once someone starts rewriting what happened, the best thing you can have is a recording of what actually did. By the time Ridgeview's attorney left, the boundary fight had shifted completely. Their own lawyer had confirmed the encroachments were real. Gregory had lost any assumption of automatic access, and Brenda's final defense now depended on convincing everyone that the overnight painting had been a contractor mistake. She still believed that story might save her. She had no idea the camera above my workshop had watched the whole thing. Laura did not send Brenda another argument. She sent the footage to Sheriff David Turner. The next morning, David sat at my kitchen table with the video running on my laptop, while Laura watched from across the room. At 1:17 a.m., Brenda's SUV stopped beside my east boundary. Todd got out, moved the chain. The contractor followed. Then Brenda stepped through after them. David watched without speaking. The video showed the sprayer being unloaded. Brenda pointing at the wall. Todd helping position equipment. The first pass of beige paint covering Henry Morgan's red boards. Then Brenda walking up with a flashlight to inspect the stencil. When the clip ended, David leaned back. She told her lawyer this was a contractor misunderstanding. Yes, he looked at the screen again. That is not what this looks like. Laura was more careful. It's evidence of deliberate entry and direction. We'll let the legal process determine exactly how it's characterized. David nodded. Send me the original file, not just the copy. I already preserved it. I handed him one of the drives. That afternoon, Amy came by to sign a written statement. She described seeing Brenda and Gregory near the rear gate before the painting. She did not claim to know everything they discussed. She only wrote what she could support. They were looking toward Caleb's barn, the gravel lane, and the drainage strip, she said as Laura typed. Gregory kept pointing at the map. Brenda kept pointing toward the Morgan side. Laura read the statement back to her. Anything here you aren't sure of? Amy shook her head. No. Anything you want to add? Amy hesitated. One thing. She looked at me. I heard Brenda say something about Caleb treating that strip like it was separate from Ridgeview. Laura stopped typing. Exact words, not exact enough for quotation marks. Then we described the substance, not a quote. That was how the case kept getting stronger. Nobody needed to improve the truth. We just needed to preserve it. The next break came from Ridgeview's own payment records. Laura had requested documentation related to the contractor who painted the barn. What came back included an invoice dated the morning after the trespass. The description read, "Exterior Compliance Emergency." I stared at the line. Emergency? Laura turned the page. The payment had been approved by Todd. There was no attached board vote, no written authorization from me, no work order identifying Ridgeview-owned property. Nothing explaining why an HOA contractor had been sent onto a ranch outside the association at 1 in the morning. Then Laura found the timing. The contractor invoice had been created before Brenda sent the letter, claiming my barn was now compliant. That mattered. It showed the HOA was not merely defending a contractor's accidental mistake afterward. Someone had treated the painting as official HOA business. Laura called Ridgeview's attorney. I listened from the other side of the table. I have your client's contractor invoice, she said, and I have video showing Brenda Lawson and Todd Mercer on Morgan Ranch directing the work. There was a long pause. Then, I'll need copies. You'll receive them. Another pause. Was my client aware of the camera? Laura looked at me. No, that was the answer. Brenda had spent days rebuilding the story because she thought the only evidence was my word against hers. Now there was a timestamp, a payment, a witness, a certified letter, a survey, and video. By evening, the first Ridgeview homeowners had started asking questions. Amy called to tell me residents were demanding to know why HOA dues had paid for work on property Ridgeview did not own. Todd apparently told one homeowner the board had approved it. That claim lasted less than an hour. Someone checked the meeting minutes. No vote existed. Then Brenda tried a different explanation. Told residents the painting had been necessary to protect neighborhood appearance while a boundary issue was being reviewed. That was worse, because now she was admitting the boundary was unresolved when the work happened. Laura heard about the statement and wrote it down. Every time she changes the explanation, preserve it. To then, even Todd seemed nervous. He sent Laura an email saying he had signed the contractor payment only because Brenda assured him the work had been authorized. That was the first time he put distance between himself and her in writing. I read the email twice. Think he's turning? I think he's protecting himself. Same direction. Laura almost smiled. The next day, Ridgeview's attorney requested a temporary pause on further removal of disputed structures while the civil issues were sorted out. I agreed, not because Brenda had earned a favor, because the boundary was already documented. Gregory's construction route was frozen, and rushing now could only create unnecessary confusion. Patience was still working. Then Laura called me late that afternoon. Her voice was different, more focused. "Caleb, we got additional board records." "What kind?" "Correspondence between Gregory and Brenda." I looked out toward the rear gate. "What does it say?" "Enough that I want you here when we read it." I understood immediately. The camera had destroyed Brenda's contractor story. The payment record had damaged the board. But whatever Laura had just received was worse. Because for the first time, we were no longer looking at what Brenda did after midnight. We were about to find out what she knew before she ever crossed my fence. Laura had the records spread across her conference table when I arrived. Emails, board notes, development attachments, and one message from Gregory Walsh to Brenda dated nearly 3 weeks before my barn was painted. Laura slid it toward me. The line that mattered was halfway down the page. "Rear access remains dependent on resolution of Morgan boundary ownership." I read it twice. Then a third time Gregory had warned her. Not after Raymond found the monument. Before the visual buffer language appeared. Before the certified warning about my barn. Before Brenda crossed my fence at 1:17 in the morning. "She knew," I said. Laura nodded. She knew ownership was unresolved. Another email made the timing worse. Brenda had replied that Ridgeview needed to establish consistent community control along the eastern edge before Phase 2 advanced. No direct admission, no sentence saying paint the barn so we can take the road. Laura pointed that out immediately, but together with the notices, the invented buffer, the overnight painting, and the access map. This destroys the innocent mistake defense. That was enough. We did not need a dramatic confession. We had chronology. By the next evening, Ridgeview had called an emergency homeowners meeting. The community hall filled before Brenda arrived. People who had ignored HOA meetings for years were standing along the walls holding copies of dues statements and printed emails. Amy sat near the front. Todd sat beside Brenda, but there was space between their chairs. That told me plenty. Brenda opened by insisting the board had acted to protect property values during a confusing boundary dispute. Someone shouted, "At 1 in the morning?" Another homeowner asked who authorized HOA money for the painter. Brenda tried to redirect toward Phase 2. That only made things worse. Laura had provided Ridgeview's counsel with the development correspondence, and the attorney confirmed the rear access issue had been known before the painting. The room changed after that, not loud at first, just cold. Brenda looked around at people who had once accepted every letter she signed without question, and realized they were no longer listening to her title. They were listening to the documents. She raised her voice. Everything I did was meant to protect this community's property values. Amy stood. She did not shout, "Whose property?" The room went silent. Brenda stared at her. Amy continued. Caleb's barn wasn't ours. His land wasn't ours. So whose property were you protecting when you paid people to cross his fence? Brenda had no answer that survived the question. Todd stood next. For a second, I thought he was going to defend her. Instead, he placed a folded letter on the table. I resign as vice president, effective immediately. Brenda turned toward him. You approved that contractor because you told me it was authorized. You were there. Todd looked at the floor. I know. That admission settled over the room harder than any speech. The homeowners demanded a vote. Brenda objected to procedure. Ridgeview's attorney checked the bylaws. The vote went forward. By an overwhelming majority, Brenda Lawson was removed as president. She did not storm out. That would have been easier to watch. She simply gathered her papers, while people she had controlled for years avoided looking at her. Then Gregory's problem arrived. His investors had received notice of the boundary dispute, and the emails now tied to the access plan. Until title and construction rights were resolved, they froze funding tied to the rear route portion of Phase 2. The 6 homes were not canceled, but the cheap access strategy was dead unless a court gave Gregory rights he did not currently have. He called me the next morning. Caleb, we should talk business. I can make an offer for the strip. I'm not selling it. An easement then? For construction traffic? Yes. No. He exhaled. You understand this reroute costs money. I understand exactly why you wanted my lane. That isn't personal. Neither is my answer. I ended the call. For the first time since the barn was painted, Brenda no longer controlled the HOA. Todd was gone. Gregory's investors had stepped back. The paper trail had done what shouting never could, but the story was not finished. My barn was still beige-white, several Ridgeview structures still crossed the legal line, and Gregory still believed a judge might give him some right to use land my family had owned long before Ridgeview existed. Laura called me that afternoon. We have a hearing date. Judge Melissa Grant. I looked across the ranch toward Henry Morgan's barn. The stencil was still visible in the sun. Ridgeview HOA, exterior standard compliant. Brenda had lost her office. Gregory had lost his shortcut, but only one thing could make the boundary, the access rights, and the restoration permanent, a court order. And this time, nobody would be arguing about what Ridgeview believed it controlled. Judge Melissa Grant would be deciding what the law said it actually did. The hearing took less time than Brenda once spent lecturing me about fence color. Laura laid out the Morgan deed, the original plat, Raymond's certified survey, the iron monument coordinates, the Phase 2 access map, the HOA letters, and the footage from 1:17 a.m. Ridgeview's attorney did not challenge the survey. He couldn't. Gregory's lawyer argued instead that continued access across the rear lane would benefit the development and avoid unnecessary redesign costs. Judge Grant looked at him over her glasses. Does Mr. Morgan's deed grant your client construction access? No, Your Honor. Does Ridgeview own the disputed strip? No. Then cost does not create a property right. That ended the most important part of Gregory's argument. The court confirmed that Morgan Ranch lay outside Ridgeview HOA jurisdiction. Ridgeview's architectural rules did not apply to my barn, the certified boundary controlled. The rear gate, camera pole, decorative fencing, and portions of the drainage improvements crossing that line had to be relocated or covered by an agreement I voluntarily accepted. And Gregory had no right to send Phase 2 construction traffic across Morgan land without my consent. He would have to redesign the route. I watched him write something on a legal pad, For 6 houses, 8 feet had become expensive. Then Judge Grant turned to the barn. The video made that issue simpler. There was no signed permission, no emergency, no valid HOA authority, no misunderstanding that could explain Brenda Lawson entering my ranch after midnight and directing a contractor toward a building she had already been warned was outside Ridgeview. The property damage claims were resolved through settlement before the hearing ended. Ridgeview and Brenda would cover the professional restoration of Henry Morgan's barn, along with the documented costs tied to the unauthorized work and the boundary dispute. Laura leaned toward me. You can ask for full restoration specifications. I already know what I want. The restoration company tried 3 sample shades of red before I approved one. Not brighter, not cleaner, not modernized. I handed them an old photograph of Henry standing beside the barn decades earlier. That red. The supervisor nodded. That red. The beige-white paint came off in sections. So did the stencil. Ridgeview HOA, exterior standard compliant, disappeared 1 letter at a time until there was nothing left of Brenda's message but bare preparation marks waiting for the final coat. I stayed out of the crew's way. Some things did not need commentary. By the end of the week, the south wall was deep red again. The first time I saw it finished, I stood in the same place on the porch where I had stood that Monday morning. This time I let myself breathe. The boundary work followed. Ridgeview moved the rear gate back inside its legal line. The camera pole was relocated. The decorative fence was rebuilt where Raymond's survey said it belonged. The drainage issue required more care because water did not care about arguments or HOA politics. Laura asked whether I wanted Ridgeview to remove that portion completely. No, I said. Not if it creates runoff problems for people who had nothing to do with this. We negotiated a narrow drainage agreement that preserved the function without granting construction access or HOA control over the rest of my land. That mattered to me. Justice did not require making innocent homeowners pay for Brenda's arrogance. Gregory eventually submitted a revised Phase 2 plan using a more expensive route through land he actually controlled. He did not call me again. Todd stayed out of HOA leadership. Brenda did not. She was already out. The new Ridgeview board sent me 1 formal letter, not a violation, an acknowledgement. It confirmed that Morgan Ranch was outside HOA jurisdiction and that no Ridgeview officer, contractor, or representative had authority to enter without permission. I filed it with the others. A few weeks later, Brenda came to the ranch one last time with Laura present. She looked smaller without a board title behind her. She asked what else I wanted from her. Money had been handled. The barn was restored. The line was corrected. I thought about Henry, about the chain Todd moved, about watching beige paint cover 60 years of family history, while 3 people assumed I would simply accept it. Then I gave Brenda the only personal condition I cared about. Never step onto Morgan land again. She nodded. That was enough. By late autumn, permanent boundary markers had replaced Raymond's temporary stakes. I rebuilt the wooden section near my gate with weathered posts that looked like they belonged there. Beside it, I mounted 1 small sign. Private property. Respect begins at the boundary. Amy stopped her pickup when she saw the finished barn. She looked at the red boards glowing in the low afternoon light. Looks like it used to. I nodded. That's all I wanted. That was true. I never needed Ridgeview's land. I never needed Brenda publicly humiliated. I never needed Gregory's project destroyed. I needed my property respected, my grandfather's barn restored, and the law to mean the same thing for someone with an HOA title as it did for a rancher standing alone behind an old wooden fence. Brenda tried to prove her authority by painting over something my family owned. I answered the only way that mattered. I proved exactly where her authority ended.
And if there were one thing this whole experience taught me, it's that standing your ground doesn't always mean raising your voice. Sometimes it means keeping the letter instead of throwing it away, saving the camera footage, checking the deed, calling the right people, and having enough patience to let the facts speak before anger speak for you. If I had reacted that first morning with nothing but emotion, I might have missed the 8 feet of land that explained why the fire had started in the first place. My grandfather's barn ended up red again. The boundary was finally respected, and the drainage solution protected neighbor who had nothing to do with render decision. That mattered to me because protecting what's yours doesn't require hurting somebody else. Sometimes justice is simply putting things back where they belong and making sure the same line is understood the next time around. If you have ever had to stand your ground over your home, your land, or something your family worked years to reserve, type yes in the comments. And if you would have handled that first morning differently, tell me what you would have done. I read those stories, and I know plenty of folks out there have learned this lesson the hard way. And if story about ordinary people protecting their property with patience, evidence, and a little quiet courage means something to you, you're welcome to subscribe. There are more HOA, range, and plan story ahead. I'll be glad to have you along for the next one.